It looks like turmoil from a distance because if you look at the Central Military Commission, which is the party body which oversees the military, and it's the most powerful military body, if you like, they have or had 7 members as of a year and a half, 2 years ago. Xi is the chairman. Then you have 6 generals beneath him. There's one left, one general and Xi. The rest have been purged.
From a Western perspective and looking at all the negotiations that are going on around potential peace deals and peacekeeping forces and all the rest of it, the one thing that China doesn't have is combat experience for its military. And one thing from a military planning perspective, I'm really surprised that hasn't come out as a concession from Vladimir Putin and the East, or the coalition of the evil that there is instead of the coalition of the willing, would be China coming in and providing a core for a peacekeeping force, acting as a buffer between Ukraine and Russia and proposing that. That's the sort of thing Donald Trump would go, that's brilliant, let's look at that, potentially. Why do you think that hasn't happened yet?
I think China's extraordinarily wary about getting involved in overseas scraps, or it likes to project itself as a player on the international stage and goes on a lot about a new world order, about a greater role for other powers. But it's always been very cautious about being anything more than a spoiler and playing a constructive role. And I think for all the investment that we've seen from China in its army, modernizing the army in terms of its capabilities, its equipment, the way it fights a war, the big problem for them is they don't have any warfighting experience. I mean, yes, they've caused trouble in multiple places, whether it's the South China Sea, the Himalayas, around Taiwan. But in terms of fighting a full-on hot war, the last time was 1979 when they invaded Vietnam. So they haven't got that combat experience. And a lot of the effort to try and understand what Russia's doing and how it's operating, the success or otherwise of different weapons systems and strategies. And don't forget, there's a lot in common between the PLA, People's Liberation Army, and the Russian army in terms of their strategies. They're trying desperately to understand the way these systems and strategies are working in practice in Ukraine. And of course, the information that's coming back has not always been terribly encouraging.
Yeah, well, Russian doctrine is, I think, what underpinned the development of the People's Liberation Army. So their doctrine, as you say, the strategies are inexorably linked. But China itself, as it's looking at that, as it's developing its capability, do you think one of the things that backs up that doctrine is it's the art of doctrine is the art of what is taught, but what is taught is then what is practiced. Russian practice was shown that whenever they exercise militarily, it's all scripted. You've got a serial that's a bit like a television script. You go action, carry it out, and then there's cut, and it stops, and it takes reality out of it. Do you think the Chinese train in a similar way?
I think they do. I think it's very rigid. The PLA has traditionally been extremely rigid in the way it's organized and the way it perceives battle. Now, Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, committed to modernizing, to rooting out deep-seated corruption in the PLA, to changing attitudes, to try and turn it into a modern fighting force. I mean, one of the issues, though, and it was interesting seeing the American recent experience in Venezuela, which, leaving aside the ethical and moral side of things, was a textbook example of coordinating very many different types of operation in a
the complexity of that. From a military planning perspective, I was sitting there going, oh my goodness, and they've done that. That was phenomenal.
It was incredibly complex and incredibly successful. And that is a huge challenge in military strategy. It's all very well having enormously shiny pieces of kit in the numerous different domains that make up modern warfare. But the ability to bring it all together and coordinate it is really the key to success on the battlefield. And China's got no real experience of that. Russia's shown very little ability to do it in Ukraine as much as it tries. And I think China is trying very hard to understand the way you bring together. And if you did launch an invasion or an operation, whether it was a full-scale invasion or something short against Taiwan, you would really depend a lot on that. It would be very, very complex, and you'd need to bring together these multiple different facets of your military.
Well, for the audience out there, I liken it to an orchestra. And you've got an orchestra with all of these different instruments that are extremely complex. And some people know how to play them, some people don't, and they've been given different instruments. That brings a complexity and a poor sound with it. Then you hope that everyone's on the same piece of music, but that piece of music is written for the instrument. And then you have to someone that can bring all of those elements together. And that goes with the composer for the music, and then the conductor that brings it all together to get you the sound that you want out. If the military operations are as complex, if not more complex, and if you haven't got all that practiced, and music only gets good and you only get to the philharmonic orchestra level with practice, if you haven't practiced it in the complex level, you're never going to get it right.
And you mentioned, of course, the conductor, and begs the question of who is the conductor at the moment in contemporary China, because we've seen so much upheaval.
Well, I was going to come on to that, because we've seen through January sort of a purge in different elements of it, and General Zhang Yujia, who was the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, a close ally of Xi, seems to have been moved on. And we've got a number of other moves that have happened. What's happening?
Well, it looks like turmoil from a distance, because if you look at the Central Military Commission, which is the party body which oversees the military, and it's the most powerful military body, if you like, they have or had 7 members as of a year and a half, 2 years ago. Xi is the chairman. Then you have 6 generals beneath him. There's one left, one general and Xi. The rest have been purged, which gives Xi unfiltered control of the army, and Xi's got no military experience. Now, Zhang Yujia was the vice chairman of that body. He was the most powerful general, uniformed general in China. He was also the only one with any military experience. He was 75 years old. He fought in that campaign in Vietnam. He's gone. Now, in the course of 2 years, by some estimates, about 24 generals have been swept away. These include the top echelons of the rocket force, which is responsible for China's nuclear forces and other long-distance missiles, the ones which are all pointing at Taiwan. The latest purge, there have been a lot of rumors about what happened. There's been a suggestion of corruption. Well, corruption is an infinitely elastic term in China, pretty much used to describe all manner of...
Catch-all to arrest anyone for anything at any time.
Well, exactly, including political opposition, lack of loyalty. But then it's interesting that coming out of Beijing were also suggestions that he might have leaked nuclear secrets to the American, which is incredible if that is true. As well as corruption, as well as lack of loyalty. I mean, the descriptions that came out in the People's Daily, the PLA Daily, the army newspaper, suggesting that he'd betrayed the Communist Party Central Committee and the Central Military Commission, suggested it was something more significant than your run-of-the-mill corruption, which a lot of the others have been accused of. But either way, they've swept away the most senior generals in China, and there's little sign of who or what is replacing them. And so that then begs the question, well, is this a sign of weakness on the part of Xi?
That's what I was going to ask.
Or a part of strength? And of course, the party is such an opaque organization that trying to figure out what this means. And then, of course, the next question from there is, what does it mean for their military abilities, their military planning? If there's turmoil at the top of the army, the armed forces, does this mean that they are any longer be considered a battle-ready army? What is the implication for such a far-sweeping purge? But then if we take the other side of the argument with enhancing the power of Xi, as far as we can tell, Xi has been more impatient about Taiwan, about getting Taiwan. Jiang, according to American sources, because he was very much their go-to person when there was liaison, and don't forget liaison has been on and off over the years. But though he was, and he's been to the States, and Jiang was regarded as being fairly conservative, quite pragmatic. And there was a feeling that he would not allow the PLA to be pushed into premature action in Taiwan, aware of the fact that to try and take Taiwan and to fail would have enormous consequences in China, perhaps existential for the party itself.
So
And
could this be Xi removing the dissenters and therefore getting closer to making a decision for military action?
That is
against Taiwan?
certainly one way of looking at it, because he's much more gung-ho, although he's got no military experience himself. And if he's removing people who were more cautious and more conservative, there were reports that came out of Taiwan, which has pretty good intelligence on events in mainland China. And some of these reports were suggesting that Xi had been warned that his timetable to be ready for military action by 2027, just next year, he'd been told that wasn't possible, that there were too many things that still need to be sorted. It was premature, it was too fast. And perhaps he ran out of patience with them. But sort of trying to read the tea leaves of what goes on in Zhongnan High and the intentions of Xi. I mean, it brings back, it reminds me of the old Kremlinology of years gone back, dragonology, call it what you will, but there's a whole school now of people trying to figure out what goes on. And then, of course, layered on that, you've got a very excitable Chinese diaspora, particularly in the States, who come out with all sorts of imaginative thoughts whenever there's a removal of a general. I mean, last week they were full of stories about coups and military mobilization and what have you. But you need to be fairly cautious. But
well, the one thing is it's fascinating, and it's clear that Donald Trump has been focused on China from him when he first came into power with the threats he's put on Panama and Greenland and the northern routes through the Arctic opening and all the rest of it. So it's something that's focusing him, whilst the rest of the West focuses on Ukraine. And it's good to see those links. And Ian, it's always a real pleasure exploring those links with you for Frontline.
thank you for having me.
Thank you.